Hi class. Hey, chapter 9 in Wolf Hollow will begin on your digital copy on page 68. All right. The next day was Saturday. No schools. Chores, yes, but usually a chance too for some time on my own to spend as I pleased. Not so that Saturday. You and your mother will be paying a visit to the Glengarrys this afternoon, my father said when I sat down to breakfast. He used the voice that meant there would be no arguing. Do I have to? I said anyway. My father nodded. Something important shouldn't be said secondhand. But we'll be right there with you, and you'll feel better afterward. She won't have anything to hold over your head once it's all on the table. That sounded right, but I still didn't want to go. James sat across from me, moping over his eggs and worrying the edge of the white bandage across his forehead. This thing itches, and it's dumb, he said. I can't think right with it on me. To which my mother had a quick answer, wrapping a bandana around his head pirate style. Now you look like Long John Silver, she said. We knew a number of pirates thanks to Robert Louis Stevenson and my grandfather and my grandmother, who read to us after supper most nights. In no time at all, James was prancing around the house like a madman, crying, "Ahoy, mateys!" and thrusting and paring with a wooden spoon until my mother shooed him out the door into the sunshine. Henry, too. "Stay near," she called after them. "We'll take them out to prune trees," my father said, pulling on his coat, my grandfather with him. Christmas season was nearly upon us, and it was time to start shaping the small spruces we grew for selling. My father did the pruning, while my grandfather sat in the truck with a dog or two and supervised the operation. The year before, my father had let the boys practice on a crooked spruce, and they shaped it into an excellent toothpick. This year, the boys were again in charge of gathering what fell in the rows and bundling the best of it for wreaths. The house settled a little with them gone. We tidied up the breakfast things and began our Saturday chores, my mother ironing in the kitchen, the air charged with the smell of hot, clean cotton, the sound of the iron striking the board. My grandmother sat at one end of the big tiger oak table, mending socks and patching elbows. I pared apples for pies, doing my best to make one long curling ribbon from each apple. Whenever I fed the peels to the horses, they didn't seem to appreciate my efforts, but I liked pretty things, if they could be. Aunt Lily, restless without work or church, did her best to taint our Saturdays, so we were as miserable as she was. "It would be quicker if you weren't trying to do that," she told me, picking up a long peel at one end and bouncing the coil until it broke. I almost offered to share the chore with her, but Aunt Lily didn't have much of a knack for housework. "Did you send in Toby's film?" I asked her. She lifted her chin sharply. "Well, of course I did, Annabelle. Supervising the mail is a great duty. Once it is in my hands, it gets sorted and sent with no nonsense whatsoever." "Oh, I know," I said. I didn't mean anything." Aunt Lily gave a little nod. "You shall have the photographs in no time at all," she said, "though I'm not sure why that man has our camera or right to what is ours, all that expensive film. Sending it in, getting it back, and so on and so forth, making more work for us to do. And for what?" My mother shook her head at the R's. She had won the camera and everything that went with it. "I'm going to visit Ruth," she said to me. "Do you want to come along?" Well, I didn't. The very thought of it scared me. But I said, "Yes," I said, "I do." And when the ironing and the paring and the washing were all done, I put on my jacket and hat and went with my mother out the door. Ruth lay in her bed, the covers tucked up across her thin chest. She wore a black silk eye patch. Green and yellow bruise seeped from beneath it and across her cheek. Beyond that, she was as pale as February. "Hi, Ruth." I said after our mothers had spent a little time fussing over her and then settled themselves in the sitting room for a talk. Does it hurt? Ruth nodded slowly. She had not yet said anything, but thank you, ma'am, when my mother gave her a twist of wax paper filled with molasses drops. Are you coming back to school soon? Ruth started to shake her head, but then stopped. My parents won't let me go back there, she said, looking away from me. I have to go to a school in Sewickley now. I was stunned. All the way into the city? My father works there, Annabelle. We only live out here because my grandpa left us this house when he died. We never meant to stay so long, but it was nice here, quiet. She looked back at me and I could see that she was crying. But we're going to sell the house and move to the city now. I had spent years growing up with Ruth, one of the sweetest, gentlest people I knew, and I began to cry too. I am so sorry you got hurt, I said. Ruth stiffened. I didn't get hurt, she said. Someone hurt me. I wiped my face. Did you see anything? Not really. Something moved on the hillside, and I looked up, and that's why the rock hit me so square in the eye. If I'd been looking down just a little. She brought her knees up and crossed her wrist under her chin. They say I'll get used to it, but I don't think I will. Time to go, Annabelle, my mother said from the doorway. Ruth needs her rest. When I said goodbye, I didn't even hug Ruth or wish her well. I didn't know that this would be the last time I'd ever see her. The visit to the Glengarrys was worse. It was strange to sit between my parents on a threadbare settee in the Glengarrys' front room, while Betty and her grandparents sat on kitchen chairs arranged in a line across from us. They sat higher than we did, and their faces were serious, but my parents were calm and warm on either side of me. I'm glad for the chance to thank you, Mr. Glengarry, for the jewel weed. By the time I got home from Ohio, Betty was already on the mend. We're very grateful for your help. And we're glad to give it, always, my mother said. The but hovered over her lips. My father said, we want to talk to you about what's been going on at school. So do we, Mr. Glengarry said. Betty has told us some very serious things about what happened to Ruth. To Ruth, my mother said. We're not here about Ruth. We're here about what happened to James, our youngest, and to Annabelle. The Glengarrys looked puzzled. Betty simply stared straight at me, unmoving. Everyone in the room knew why Betty had come to live in the country, so I did not expect to surprise anyone when I said, Betty told me that if I didn't bring her things, she would hurt me and my brothers, which she did. First me with a stick, twice, and then a quail she caught, and then yesterday my little brother with a sharp wire strung across the path to school. But I think Andy Woodbury helped with that part. It came out faster than the silence that followed it. Betty? Her grandmother looked torn right down the middle, one half resigned, the other a little helpful. Did you do these things? Betty shook her head. I never did, she said. I wouldn't do that. But you did, and you know you did, I insisted, even though I brought you a penny and tried to be your friend. My mother put a hand on my knee to hush me. Annabelle wouldn't lie about such things, she said. But Betty would? Mr. Glengarry didn't sound angry, but I could see where this was headed. I imagined that my own grandfather would stand up for me no matter what I'd done. Ask Toby. If you don't believe me, I said, he saw what happened when I gave her the penny. She threw it away and hit me with a stick, and I have a bruise to prove it. And when she killed the quail, Toby told me to leave her alone, but she didn't. She's the one who strung that wire. I know it. Hush now, Annabelle, my mother said. It's all right. Toby? Mr. Glengarry, that wild man? He looked at his granddaughter. Tell them what you told us. When she didn't say anything, her grandmother put her arm around Betty and said, It's okay, honey. You don't need to be afraid now." Betty tipped her head to one side just a little, her eyes still on me. "I saw Toby on the hillside, up above where Ruth got hurt," she said. "But he scares me so bad I was afraid to say anything about it." I remembered Ruth telling me she'd seen something moving on the hill just before the rock hit her, but it couldn't have been Toby. "You're the one who's scary, Betty," I said. "Toby didn't have anything to do with all that. Toby would never hurt Ruth." "Well, he surely wasn't aiming at her," said Mr. Glengarry. "He was aiming at the German." Mr. Ansel, the German. Mr. Glengarry had lost a brother in the first big war, and he was one of the people who didn't speak to Mr. Ansel. "Toby's crazy because of what the Germans did to him. If anyone would be throwing rocks at a German, it would be Toby." "I didn't see Toby," I said, "and I was right there in the road with Ruth." To Betty I said, "You weren't anywhere around when she got hurt, Betty, so how come you're the only one who saw him?" "I was in the belfry," Betty said. "Annie wanted to show me the school bell when everyone went out to recess. There's a little window up there. Looks right out onto the road and the hill. I saw it happen better than you could from down below." My mother leaned forward a little, but I didn't say anything about it until now. If anyone was a friend to Toby, it was my mother. It was clear that she didn't believe Betty, but I, too, had kept a secret because I was afraid of someone bigger and stronger than I was, and she knew that. "I thought he would hurt me if I did," Betty said. I was stunned at how small she sounded. She, who had turned the tables with no effort at all. "Andy's not afraid of Toby," I said. "How come he didn't say anything?" "Because I was the only one who saw what happened. Andy was on the other side of the belfry, messing around with the swallow's nest, and by the time he made it over to the window, Toby was gone. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. I was afraid Toby might hurt Andy, too." She sounded so scared that I almost believed her. "What about the wire across the path?" I said. "Toby wouldn't hurt James." "Maybe not, but I'd take that path too," she said. "Maybe Toby meant it for me." "That's enough," Mr. Glengarry said. "Toby's crazy. Everyone knows that, and you can't expect anything but crazy business from a crazy man." "I don't blame Betty one bit for being afraid of Toby," Mrs. Glengarry said. She was a quiet woman, and I was surprised to hear the grit in her voice. But here was a chance to believe that Betty was nothing but a pig-tailed girl in a blue jumper afraid of a bad man who carried guns wherever he went. "Perhaps not." My mother rose to her feet. "But if anyone threatens Annabelle again, there won't be any more talking about it." I wasn't sure what she meant by that, but when my father took me by the hand and we stood next to her, I felt like a giant, like when I stood on our hilltop looking down into Wolf Hollow, or when I held a bird's egg in my hand. After we got home, my parents spent some time in the yard talking. I went inside and straight up to my room. My steady world was spinning, and with each turn of the pinwheel, I became more confused. I didn't believe that Toby was crazy. Sad, maybe, quiet, odd even, to choose a life alone, sleeping in the smokehouse, walking the hills day after day, but not crazy, not dangerous crazy. And besides, why would Toby throw a rock from a hillside when 2 girls and 2 horses stood below? If Toby wanted to hurt Mr. Ansel, he had chances every day all over the place, when there wouldn't be any girls or horses standing by. Toby was a man who wouldn't even shoot a sleeping deer, who took pictures of May-apples. He gave me back a penny when he didn't need to. He had never hurt anyone since coming back from that terrible war, not that I knew of. I didn't believe Toby was crazy, not even a little bit, and I didn't believe he would hurt Mr. Ansel, German or not. But if Betty and Andy had been in the belfry, they couldn't have been on that hillside. They couldn't have thrown that rock. I lay on my bed and thought my thoughts until I heard my mother calling me down to help get supper started, and a little beyond that. "You must have enough wool by now to knit a sweater," my grandmother said as we washed and peeled potatoes together at the sink. "What wool?" I sloshed a potato in the water until it came away white. "You've been gathering wool this whole time, Annabelle. Not a word out of you." I shrugged. I was just thinking about Ruth. A terrible thing to happen to anyone, let alone a sweet girl like her. But you don't think Toby did it, even by accident, do you? By now, everyone in the house knew about the conversation at Glengarrys that afternoon. Aunt Lily had sniffed and said, "That Toby has always smelled like brimstone to me." Henry had said, "Nah, Toby's not like that." James had said, "Avast there, matey," which we took to mean no. My grandfather had shaken his head and mumbled something about sheep and wolf's clothing. I already knew how my mother felt. My father, I wasn't sure. He hadn't said a word on our way home from the Glengarrys' house, and once home, he'd spoken only to my mother and then gone straight away to his chores. "Oh, I don't know what I think," my grandmother said, cutting a potato so thin I could see light through the slice. Hers were the best scalloped potatoes in the country. "Toby is odd, I have to say, and those guns of his give me pause. But I've never seen him act rough with anyone, and I've never heard of him speaking ill of the Germans, including Mr. Ansel." "Well, Toby doesn't speak much about anything, I had to admit. No, he does not. But I've always wanted people to judge me by my actions, and I hope I can do the same for him, who has never done me wrong, or my family, neither." My father came in to supper that night, pink with evening, but smelling like soot. "I spent some time with Toby this afternoon," he said in the middle of eating my mother's ham, my grandmother's mashed potatoes, and my cauliflower, which James referred to as little white trees, and he rarely ate. We all looked at my father and waited, especially wondered what Toby had had to say about the goings-on of the past week. "I did most of the talking," he said. "Knocked on the door, Toby answered, asked me in. There was no place to sit but on one chair, and I could not sit if he couldn't, so we both stood there, looking at each other like a couple of goats." My father didn't admire goats very much. If lazy, was a little goat, if stupid, a goat, if dirty, a goat, and the rest of us too. We waited. He would not have mentioned the visit at all if there were not more to tell. "That shack of his is a hard place," he said, "though he's nicing it up a bit. Not much of a bed, more like a nest. Pine boughs covered by burlap, no pillow, an old army blanket, the one chair cast off, a fire pit dug in the corner with just a hole for a vent, odds and ends on the books above, but—" And he stopped, and here he stopped, sat back on his chair, and ran a hand over his jaw. There were pictures everywhere, on all four walls, of the orchards, the woods, sky all by itself in lots of them, at sundown. He paused for a moment. They were beautiful, and I wanted to see them all, but the light was going, and I didn't want to presume. He hadn't invited me, and he seemed a little nervous to have me there. I don't imagine he gets many visitors. I couldn't remember my father ever saying so much in one stretch. I told him about what the Glengarrys had said, what Betty had said. I asked him if he'd been on that hillside, and he said he had no reason to throw a rock at anyone, German or not. My grandfather said, "If anyone had a reason to throw a rock at a German, it might be Toby." "Or anyone who lost kin over there," my mother said sharply, "of which there are plenty." "And then he said something strange," my father said. "He said, and I think I've got this right, they made scratches on the turtle stone. And he didn't say anything after that except to ask that you, Annabelle, bring him his pictures as soon as they come." Aunt Lily waggled her fork at me. "Our camera, our film, his pictures. I like that." But I was wondering about the turtle stone, a big boulder in Wolf Hollow shaped like a turtle's shell and threaded through with quartz in something of a grid, also like a turtle shell. Everyone knew about the turtle stone in our area. It was in a little clearing, as if the trees had not dared get too close, and the ground around it was covered with ferns and flowering weeds. It was a pretty place, but serious too. We always figured that the Indians had used it for ceremonies. If we hadn't had a church for our ceremonies, we probably would have chosen the turtle stone too.